We've all seen the scenes where convicts are and their sides are getting a bit frustrated. But have you ever seen a judge get into their savage mode? I mean, there are some judges who put on their dark masks for the slightest provocations. Let's take a look at those. The first one on today's list is a person who got to decide his own sentence. Yes, he did. This dude named Christopher McNabb was convicted of murdering his own 2-week-old daughter Aaliyah back in 2019. Yeah, you heard that right. His own flesh and blood. It's just unimaginable, right? Now, get this. McNabb actually had the guts to appeal his conviction, claiming that the evidence against him was all circumstantial and that there were other reasonable explanations for his daughter's death. But thankfully, the Georgia Supreme Court didn't buy it and upheld his conviction. But here's where things get really messed up. During the trial, McNabb's lawyer didn't even object to some seriously damning evidence, like McNabb's history of drug use and his physical abuse of Aaliyah's mother, Courtney Bell, who, by the way, is also his cousin. Yeah. And guess what? McNabb's lawyer agreed with the prosecution to limit the evidence of drug use and abuse to just 2 weeks leading up to the murder. Can you believe that? I mean, why would anyone do that? But wait, it gets even crazier. After McNabb was convicted, the judge, John M. Ott, actually asked him what sentence he would give him if he were innocent and someone else were guilty. Can you imagine? McNabb had the nerve to say maximum sentence. And guess what? The judge actually gave it to him. I mean, seriously, what kind of savage judge allows a convicted murderer to decide his own sentence? Next, we have this 18-year-old girl named Penelope Soto from South Florida, and she got into some pretty serious trouble. It all started when Penelope flipped off the judge, Judge George Rodriguez Tremont, during the court hearing. Can you believe that? She actually waved her middle finger at the judge. And guess what? The judge didn't take it lightly at all. He sentenced her to 30 days in jail for contempt of court. I mean, 30 days. That's a serious punishment for a young girl like Penelope. But then, things took an unexpected turn. Just a few days later, Penelope was back in court, and this time she was completely remorseful. She was in tears as she apologized to the judge, her lawyer, and even her family. She admitted that her behavior was irrational and wrong, and she was truly sorry for insulting the judge. And guess what? The judge actually dropped the 30-day sentence. Can you believe it? He cited her being a first-time offender, her admission of abusing Xanax, her willingness to overcome her addiction by attending a drug treatment program, and her sincere apology as reasons for his decision. But the judge didn't let Penelope off the hook completely. He also gave her a stern warning about the consequences of drug abuse. He told her that drugs could put her in a very difficult situation and that using Xanax as a party drug could even turn her into a convicted felon. It was a wake-up call for Penelope, and she seemed to have learned her lesson. During the hearing, Penelope's lawyer also apologized on her behalf, explaining that she was impaired by drugs and alcohol when she acted out in court. But do you know what's even crazier? The judge also dropped the $10,000 bond that he had set for Penelope, and she was released from jail right there in the courtroom. Wow. Next, we have a judge who throws the book in anger. So, there's a guy named Jose Azucena standing trial for multiple sex offenses against children. The jury selection is underway, and everything seems to be going smoothly. But then, things take a turn for the worse. One potential juror, a nurse who had dealt with child abuse and sexual abuse in her line of work, expresses her concerns about impartiality. Now, how does the judge, Clark County District Judge Richard Scotty, respond? Well, Judge Scotty starts cursing and berating the juror, yelling at her and even threatening her. In a courtroom where justice is supposed to prevail, a judge is throwing a tantrum like a child. But it doesn't stop there. Oh no, it gets even more outrageous. Judge Scotty actually throws a book against the courtroom wall to emphasize his frustration. As if that wasn't enough, he accuses the juror of trying to make it up and get out of jury duty and goes on a rant about how she's destroying the justice system. Defense counsel tries to intervene, but Judge Scotty refuses to listen. He tells the juror to go home and dismisses her with a snarky comment about her attitude. The defense counsel moves to dismiss the entire jury pool, citing the judge's behavior as having a chilling effect on the rest of the jury. So, how does Judge Scotty respond? He calls the motion ludicrous and denies it. Now, here's the thing. The Nevada Supreme Court steps in and orders a new trial for Jose Azucena. Why? Because they recognize that Judge Scotty's misconduct interfered with the defendant's right to a fair and impartial trial. They acknowledge that the judge created an atmosphere of intimidation and did nothing to alleviate the impact of his behavior. They see that an impartial judge could not have been selected under these circumstances. Next, we have a judge who couldn't have this convict in his court. He was so tired of her. This is an insane case that went down in a Michigan courtroom. It was one of those moments that left everyone in the room in shock and awe, and not in a good way. I'm talking about this savage judge who had absolutely zero tolerance for a convicted killer who showed no remorse for her heinous crime. Now, this woman, named Camille Gamet, was in court for the murder of her boyfriend, Marcel Hill. And let me tell you, this was no ordinary murder. Judge John McBain, who was presiding over the case, called it one of the worst cold-blooded murders he had ever seen. Gamet was sentenced to life in prison, and rightly so. But here's where things took a turn. During the sentencing, members of Hill's family spoke about the pain and loss they had experienced. And how did Gamet react? She was caught rolling her eyes and sniggering. Can you believe that? But it didn't stop there. Gamet even had the audacity to interrupt Hill's aunt and say, "Is that it?" Can you imagine the nerve of this woman showing absolutely no remorse for taking someone's life? Well, that's when Judge McBain had enough. He didn't hold back one bit. He looked at Gamet straight in the eye and told her, "You're going to shut your mouth or I'm going to have some duct tape put on it." And he didn't stop there. McBain went on to say, "You were relentless. You stabbed, you stabbed, you stabbed, you stabbed, you stabbed until he was dead."
Department 2, you were relentless. You stabbed, you stabbed, you stabbed, you stabbed, you stabbed until he was dead.
He didn't mince words, that's for sure. He didn't shy away from telling Gamet exactly what he thought of her heinous crime. In fact, he even said that he hoped she rots in prison, and that if this was a death penalty state, she'd be getting the chair. That's how serious he was about holding Gamet accountable for her actions. He wasn't about to let her off lightly or let her get away with showing no remorse for taking a human life. Now, Gamet's defense team tried to argue that she acted in self-defense, but let's be real here. Judge McBain saw right through that. He wasn't buying any of it. He knew that this was a case of cold-blooded murder, plain and simple. Finally, we have a daughter who was sentenced to death. A daughter who was driven by greed, who betrayed her own flesh and blood, her own father. Bibi Nazila Hababuddin, once a daughter, is now a convict. Her father, a septuagenarian, was brutally beaten to death in his own home. The judge, High Court Judge Sandil Kisun, described it as reprehensible, the savage beating that her father endured. Now, what drove her to commit such a heinous crime was her greed, her insatiable desire for her father's wealth. She forced his signature to will his possessions over to her, but even that wasn't enough. She went even further, procuring an accomplice, Lyndon Lewis, called Bullet, to kill her own father. The verdict was unanimous, and the jury's decision was clear after hours of deliberation. Bibi Nazila and Lyndon Lewis were both sentenced to death. Their reactions were telling, their distress visible as the marshal read them their fate. Lewis placed his head in his hands while Bibi couldn't believe what she was hearing, her hands on her head in shock. Justice Kishun spoke of the rage and revulsion that society feels towards a horrific killing. The brutality, the violence, and the viciousness of the crime are all driven by Bibi Nazila's greed for her father's possessions. It was a motive that was unfathomable, unthinkable, and it warranted the harshest penalty, the death penalty. When given the chance to speak, Lewis thanked his attorney for his defense, but claimed that he didn't have a fair trial. Bibi Nazila, on the other hand, maintained her innocence by simply saying that she was innocent of the offense. But the facts presented in court were damning. The confession of the hitman implicating her as the mastermind behind the plot to kill her own father. Alright guys, now that's what we call a no-nonsense attitude from the judges. Throughout these 5 cases, we can see the courtroom can be something like a battlefield, where judges don't hesitate to lay down the law. After all, justice can sometimes be a double-edged sword. Anyway, thank you for joining, stay tuned for more gripping content, and until then, remember to always mind your manners in the courtroom.